In 1975, a doctor published a book that changed everything, not because it was beautiful or comforting, but because it contained data, real data, documented, collected over 10 years of working with patients who died and came back. His name was Raymond Moody. And what he discovered was so specific, so consistently repeating and so inexplicable within existing science that the scientific community did the only thing it could. It tried to destroy his reputation. He was called a charlatan. Colleagues turned away. Journals refused to publish him. Universities closed their doors. He nearly broke. But what he discovered cannot be disproved to this day, and that is why, 50 years after his book came out, we are talking about him today. Stay with me, because 3 of Moody's discoveries that you are about to hear will shatter at least one belief you considered unshakable, regardless of whether you believe in the afterlife or not. Let's start with what Moody found at the very beginning. What caused him, a man with 2 doctoral degrees in medicine and philosophy, to undertake research that he understood perfectly well would destroy his academic career? In 1965, as a medical student, he attended a lecture by Professor George Ritchie. Ritchie described how he had died from double pneumonia in 1943. He was dead for 9 minutes. And he described what happened during those 9 minutes with such precision and such detail that no known medical explanation could account for it. Moody, a skeptic by training and temperament, could not dismiss this, not because he wanted to believe, but because the data wouldn't allow it. He began collecting cases, quietly, methodically, without publicity, understanding that if what he was discovering was real, it would change everything science thought about the nature of consciousness. And if it wasn't real, his career would end before it began. Over 10 years he collected more than 150 cases. And what he found in these cases, what ultimately caused him to publish the book despite understanding the consequences, was this: 9 elements that repeated in every single case, regardless of the person's age, regardless of their education, regardless of their country. And here is where everything is overturned, regardless of their religious beliefs. Atheists described exactly the same thing as devout Catholics. Buddhists described exactly the same thing as Baptists. People who had never believed in anything their entire lives came back with descriptions that matched word for word the descriptions of people who had prayed every day of their lives. This was the first blow Moody dealt to 2 camps simultaneously. Skeptics said that near-death experience is a hallucination produced by the dying brain, reflecting the person's cultural expectations. But if that were true, an atheist would hallucinate one thing and a believer another. That didn't happen. The religious said that near-death experience confirmed their specific teaching about the afterlife. But if that were true, a Catholic would see a Catholic heaven and a Buddhist one. That didn't happen either. What everyone described was something that didn't fit into any existing system, something more specific and simultaneously more strange than anything any religion or any philosophy had offered. The 9 elements Moody documented in every case. First, ineffability. People returned with the conviction that what they experienced cannot be fully expressed in words. Not because they have nothing to say, but because human language was created to describe physical reality and has no words for what they encountered. Second, auditory sensations at the moment of death. Many described a sound, humming, buzzing music, at the very moment of separating from the body. Third, leaving the body, observing their own body from outside, with precise details of what was happening, details subsequently confirmed by medical staff. Fourth, the tunnel, a sensation of moving through dark space toward light. Fifth, meeting others, with deceased relatives or with beings they didn't recognize. Sixth, meeting the light, a being of light that didn't blind but that they described as a source of unconditional love and understanding. Seventh, the life review, seeing their entire life simultaneously, experiencing every moment from both sides. Eighth, the border, the moment when they understood that further meant no return, and they made a choice or received instruction to come back. Ninth, transformation, People who returned became fundamentally different. They stopped fearing death, became less materialistic, more prone to compassion. These changes were documented not as subjective feelings, but as objective behavioral changes observed by relatives and colleagues. And now, the story that stopped Moody himself when it came to him. The one he kept returning to in his lectures for decades, because it illustrated everything he had found better than any statistical summary could. Maria was a migrant worker from Mexico. She had a severe heart attack and was admitted to Harborview Medical Center in Seattle in 1977. During resuscitation, she experienced what she later described as leaving her body and floating above the hospital. She watched the medical team working on her from above. Then, and this is the part that cannot be explained, she described drifting outside the building entirely, to the third-floor ledge on the north side of the hospital, where she saw a tennis shoe, a single left tennis shoe, dark blue with a worn patch near the little toe and a lace tucked under the heel. When she told the social worker Kimberly Clark Sharp about this shoe, Sharp went to look. She checked every ledge on that floor. On the north side, she found it, a single left tennis shoe, dark blue, with a worn patch near the little toe, and a lace tucked under the heel. Exactly as Maria had described, from a position she could never have physically accessed, with details invisible from any ground-level vantage point and impossible to see from any window at that angle. Moody used this case not as proof of the afterlife. He was always careful about that word. He used it as what he called data-demanding explanation. Data that existing neuroscience cannot account for, because a dying brain does not drift to the third-floor ledge of a hospital and observe a shoe it has never seen. Now, what happened after publication? And here Moody's story becomes one nobody could have predicted. Life After Life was published in 1975. In the first year, 1 million copies were sold. This was not a scientific monograph, it was a cultural phenomenon. People who had lost loved ones and didn't know what to do with that loss found in it something that neither religion nor psychology had offered. Specific descriptions, from real people, with real names, with real details that could be verified. For millions of people, it permanently changed how they thought about death. But what Moody hadn't expected was the reaction from the scientific community, which was not simply skeptical. It was aggressive. He was called a fraud. His methodology was demolished in reviews. He was invited to conferences only to be publicly torn apart. One of the country's leading neurologists wrote an open letter calling his work dangerous to society, not inaccurate, not methodologically weak, dangerous, because if people stopped fearing death, it would undermine foundations on which much of our society rests. And here is what happened to Moody himself. This is the part of his story that almost nobody knows, because he spoke about it rarely and reluctantly. The pressure he experienced after publication was so intense that at some point he reached an edge, a psychological one. He described periods when he couldn't work, when he doubted everything he had done, when he asked himself, what if they're right? What if I deceived myself and deceived millions of people? What if all of this is simply what people want to see when they die? The man who had collected more data about what happens after death than anyone else in history spent nights doubting the reality of what he himself had documented. This is not weakness, this is honesty. And it is precisely this honesty that ultimately saved his work. Because a man who doubts is not someone who believes blindly. He is someone whose data can be trusted. He continued, collected thousands more cases, and arrived at a discovery that he himself called the strangest thing he had found in 50 years of research: the psychomantium. Ancient Greeks used mirrors for contact with the deceased in special sanctuaries they called psychomantiums. Moody, not a mystic but a researcher with 2 doctoral degrees, decided to recreate this experimentally. He built a special chamber, a dark room with a large mirror dimly lit from below. A person sat alone before the mirror, after several hours of preparation involving focused remembrance of the deceased person they wanted to see, and looked into the mirror. Moody conducted this experiment with hundreds of people. The results he published, carefully understanding the reaction they would provoke, were as follows. Approximately half the participants reported visions in the mirror. Not blurred images, specific ones, recognizable, people they had lost, with specific details impossible to explain through projection of wishes. A woman saw her mother, who told her something about a family secret the woman didn't know. This secret was subsequently confirmed through other sources. A man saw his brother, and the brother told him something about his final hours of life, something that contradicted the official version of events. The contradiction was subsequently confirmed. Moody didn't call this proof. He called it data requiring explanation, data that receives no explanation within existing scientific models. But Moody's most important discovery is neither the psychomantium nor the 9 elements of near-death experience. The most important thing is what he said in one of his final interviews when he was already past 80. He was asked, after 50 years of research, "Do you believe that life after death exists?" He didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "I no longer believe, I know. But this knowing is not what I expected when I started. I thought I would find proof of heaven or hell or reincarnation. I didn't find that. I found something different. I found that consciousness is not a product of the brain, that it exists independently, and that the death of the body is not the end of consciousness. That is all I know with certainty. Everything else is beyond what my data can confirm." That is the answer of a man who spent 50 years searching for the truth, who paid for that search with his academic career, his mental health, and his reputation in the scientific community, and who at the end did not recant, did not soften, did not say he had been wrong, but said exactly what he could say with certainty, nothing more, nothing less. Consciousness is not a product of the brain. The death of the body is not the end of consciousness. And 50 years of data stand behind every word. Write in the comments, did you ever have an experience you couldn't explain? Something that made you question what you thought you knew about death and what comes after? Because that experience, and whatever it was, is exactly the kind of data Moody spent 50 years collecting, and it deserves to be said out loud.